know that feeling when a movie leaves such an impression that you just have to create something in its honor? Well, that's exactly what happened to me after watching Deadpool 2.
There's nothing we don't share. Floor space, dental floss, even condoms.
Yeah, that movie stuck with me like a gum on a shoe. But instead of trying to scrape it off, I decided to channel that energy into something creative. I couldn't shake the urge to make a mini statue of Deadpool, but I didn't want it to just sit around collecting dust. And then it hit me, why not make him into an air freshener? Initially, the plan was simple. Sculpt Deadpool from clay, pop in a store-bought air freshener, maybe extend a few wires for convenience, and call it a day. But of course, nothing involving Deadpool should be too straightforward, right? So I decided to mix things up, adding some twists and turns along the way. Before we dive into the fun part, let's talk about what you'll need to make your very own Deadpool air freshener. Now, I might have forgotten something important, like my sanity, but I'm pretty sure this list covers most of it. Choosing the right air freshener took some time, but I settled on the Glade Sense and spray. However, any air freshener can work with some modifications. First, I removed the top cover, no longer needed. This model sprays upwards, which isn't ideal for Deadpool, so I enlarged the spray hole with a drill. I found an L-shaped nozzle from an old air freshener to redirect the spray. Now, plastic welding might sound fancy, but it's really just a fancy way of saying I stuck this nozzle on with a soldering iron and determination. But, being the cautious type, I wasn't taking any chances. I heated up a few staples over a candle and poked them through both pieces for added support. With the nozzle securely in place, I added a little more plastic on top just to be safe. Then I finished things off with a piece of heat shrink over the new nozzle to help me better visualize where the spray hole should be. For the base, I started by designing and printing out a template. Once it was printed, I grabbed a trusty glue stick and attached the template to a sturdy piece of cardboard. And by sturdy, I mean thick enough to give solid support, but not so thick that it feels like you're cutting through a brick wall. In case you're wondering, a box from cat food was just perfect. With the template securely in place, I armed myself with a hobby knife because nothing says precision like a sharp blade and hopefully steady hands, and cut out all the pieces. Next came the assembly. Piece by piece, I glued the base together using a hot glue gun. Why hot glue? Because it sets quickly, creates a strong bond, and gives you that satisfying feeling of things coming together. Now, I'll be the first to admit, sculpting isn't exactly my superpower. So, instead of spending hours trying to mold Deadpool from scratch, I decided to get a little creative. I found the perfect paper model online and scaled it up to fit the proportions I needed. Once I had my scaled-up Spidey printed, I went ahead and glued the template to more cardboard. Armed with a trusty pair of scissors, I cut out all the pieces, trimming away the glue tabs as I went. With everything cut out, it was time to start assembling. I glued together all of the body parts, but kept them separated for now. I followed the original Spidey model's assembly instructions, minus the glue tabs, as they wouldn't work very well with the cardboard. This method allowed me to bypass my lack of sculpting skills while still creating a solid base for the project. With our base ready and the air freshener primed for action, it was time to start assembling Deadpool's body. Think of it like putting together a puzzle, except the pieces don't quite fit the first time around. But hey, that's nothing a little patience and a lot of glue can't fix. I started by placing the air freshener into the base and securing it with a piece of paper glued underneath to keep it from moving around. Next up, it was time to start attaching the paper Spider-Man parts, starting with his most important part, the bottom. From there, I glued on the legs, feet, torso, arms, and head. This part was definitely a trial and error process. I found myself removing and re-gluing pieces more times than I'd like to admit, just to get them fit right. Once all the body parts were in place and I was satisfied with how they fit together, I covered the crotch and bottom area with some spare cardboard to ensure that the whole base was fully covered. I hot glued a piece of a wooden skewer into his left arm to act as a finger and reinforced his elbows and knees with hot glue to make sure everything stayed securely in place. With Deadpool's basic structure all pieced together, It was time to say goodbye to Spider-Man. Sorry, Spidey. The next step involves covering the entire figure with air-drying clay. But before we dive into that, we need to protect the structure beneath, because cardboard and moisture don't exactly play well together. To do this, I wrapped the whole figure in aluminum tape, encasing Spidey in a shiny new layer. The foil provides a barrier against moisture and adds a bit of extra stability. If you're planning to add extra features with an Arduino, you can mostly skip this part. But if a simpler Deadpool air freshener is what you want, here's what I did. First, I disassembled the air freshener and soldered a battery holder wires to the positive and negative contacts on the circuit board. Next, I desoldered the push button, sensor, and LED, replacing them with longer wires so I could position them wherever I wanted. After that, I reassembled the motor and gears, threading the wires for the batteries, push button, LED, and sensor through an opening I'd cut in the front. Finally, I hot glued all the components inside Deadpool's base, making sure they were secure. For extra control, I added a toggle switch to the battery's positive wire, so I could easily turn the system on or off without messing with the batteries. Now that the structure's set and the electronics are in place, it's time to give Deadpool some flesh. To get started, I took some air-drying clay and placed it in an airtight container, adding a bit of water to the mix. This keeps the clay more malleable and easier to work with, which is especially handy when you're covering an entire figure. Armed with a clay modeling spatula, I began the process of gradually covering the entire statue with a thin layer of clay. The key here is to spread the clay evenly, making sure it adheres well to the aluminum tape-wrapped structure underneath. If the clay starts to dry out and becomes difficult to spread, no worries. Just dip a wide brush in water and apply it to the clay. As I covered the figure, I made sure to get every nook and cranny. The goal here is to create a smooth, even base layer. Remember, patience is key. You want to make sure everything is well covered without any gaps. Once the entire figure was covered, it was time to let the clay dry completely. This step is crucial because it hardens the initial layer, making it easier to add those finer details and accessories later on. Now that the base layer of clay is dry and solid, it's time to add the details that make Deadpool, well, Deadpool. I started with his shoes, because everyone needs a good pair of boots. I added more clay onto the soles and used a wide clay spatula to create a pattern that mimicked the rugged texture of boots. Once the texture was just right, I dipped a brush in water and gently smoothed the newly added clay. Next up, the knife that Deadpool famously carries on his left leg. To do this, I cut a piece of a wooden skewer and attached it to his leg with a couple of pieces of aluminum tape. This gave me a sturdy base to work from. I then covered most of the skewer with clay, shaping it into the knife's handle and sheath. To help guide my work, I drew a few lines in the clay, kind of like a blueprint for where everything should go. With the shoes and knife in place, it was time to focus on Deadpool's accessories. I kept adding clay, sculpting his belt, gun holders, guns, and knee pads. As I worked, I continually smoothed the clay with a brush dipped in water, making sure each accessory blended seamlessly with the rest of the figure. It's a bit time-consuming, but watching Deadpool's personality emerge with each added detail? Totally worth it. As I continued working on Deadpool, I hit a bit of a snag. His hands just weren't looking right. Hands are tricky, and getting them to look natural can be a real challenge. So, I decided to take a step back and rework them a little bit. First things first, I used a hobby knife to carefully remove all the excess bits from the hands. Once the excess clay was cleared away, I reattached the skewer that formed the base of the hand and finger. I added a little hot glue and covered it with aluminum tape, ensuring a solid, moisture-proof foundation. To guide the sculpting process, I drew a few more visual lines on the clay. Satisfied with the initial repairs, I moved on to refining the entire base. I rolled out a fresh piece of clay using a rolling pin, creating a smooth, even layer. Bit by bit, I applied this rolled clay over the entire base, covering it again. This not only made the figure smoother, but also gave it a slightly thicker, more robust appearance. With the base now refined and the hands prepped, it was time to sculpt those finer details. I modeled Deadpool's little hands and fingers, paying close attention to the natural curves and bends. Using a combination of small sculpting tools and my own fingers, I shaped the clay, constantly smoothing and adjusting until the hands looked relatively natural and proportioned. To add more depth and detail to Deadpool's costume, I rolled out more clay using a rolling pin and cut it into thin strips with a metal ruler. These strips would become the various straps, seams, and textures that make Deadpool, well, Deadpool. After wetting the surface of the figure with a brush to help the clay adhere, I carefully placed the strips onto the prepared areas. Using my trusty clay modeling tools, I nudged and adjusted each strip into position, making sure everything lined up as I wanted. These tools are great for pressing the clay into the underlying layer, ensuring a strong bond and a seamless look. And if I found that I had too much clay in any area, I simply removed the excess with a hobby knife or re-wet the clay and scraped away the excess with the modeling tools. Next up, the katanas. I took 2 pieces of skewer, crossed them, and covered them in a layer of clay. With the katanas ready, it was time to attach them to Deadpool's back. I started by lightly wetting the area where the katanas would go. Then, I added a fresh layer of clay to create a soft surface for the katanas to adhere to. A little press here, a little adjustment there, and the katanas were securely in place, ready for action. At this stage of the project, I had a flash of inspiration. Why not make Deadpool audibly fart? Because, why not? To make this happen, I reworked the electronics, ditching the battery holder, LED and sensor, but kept the push button and toggle switch. I used a Pringles speaker I had on hand, removed its parts, and integrated the speaker cover into the base by cutting a precise circle in the clay. I then enlarged an existing hole to fit the new PIR sensor and LED, ensuring everything fit snugly. Once the clay was dry, I removed the LED and sensor to make painting easier without risking paint on the electronics. With the clay fully dry, it was finally time to bring Deadpool to life with some color. I started by covering the base with a layer of gray acrylic paint. Next, I turned my attention to Deadpool's body. Using red acrylic paint, I covered almost the entire figure. The key here is even coverage, making sure to get into all those nooks and crannies that make up Deadpool's unique look. Once the red was dry, I moved on to the black parts of Deadpool's suit. Using a fine brush, I painted the details like the patches on his shoulders, his gloves, and the areas around his eyes. For Deadpool's belt, I opted for brown acrylic paint, adding another layer of detail to his already complex costume. But as things often go with Deadpool, plans were about to change again. So, I won't dive too deep into the painting details just yet. Let's just say that Deadpool's journey took a few more twists and turns. As I stepped back to evaluate my work, I realized something was missing. Deadpool's colors were coming along, but he looked too flat and clean, 2 things Deadpool definitely isn't. To give his suit a more rugged, lived-in look, I decided to dirty him up. Using a sponge dipped in a watery black acrylic mix, I lightly dabbed the red parts, adding grime and shadow for texture. The katanas also needed some attention. I wrapped a thin ribbon around the tops, secured it with super glue, and painted it black, giving them a more authentic feel. Feeling inspired to add even more texture, I grabbed a cheap airbrush I had lying around. Though inexperienced with it and lacking proper paint, I decided to wing it. I mixed black acrylic paint with isopropyl alcohol and sprayed the suit. Then, thinking it was too dark, I resprayed it with red paint. It still wasn't what I had in mind, but it gave Deadpool's suit a unique look. Given how long this project had taken, I decided to leave it as is, because if I kept tweaking, I might never finish. Sometimes you just have to know when to call it a day. After adding some texture and character to Deadpool's red suit, it was time to revisit the black parts. Using a fine brush, I repainted the black areas of his suit, like the gloves, shoulder patches, and the details around his mask. Once I was relatively happy with how it all came together, I decided it was time to move on to the base. I wanted the base to complement Deadpool's look, so I opted for a stone pattern. I started by drawing the outlines of individual stones directly onto the base with a pencil. This helped map out the pattern and gave me a clear guide for the painting process. Next, I painted the entire base with a thin layer of brown acrylic paint. Once that dried, I dipped my brush into both white and black paint, blending them together to create a splodgy grey color. This was applied over the brown, creating a distressed, uneven texture, almost like real stone. With the stone pattern taking shape, I mixed a darker shade of grey to paint the mortar lines between the stones. Carefully applying this dark grey paint between the stones made them stand out, adding a bit of depth and a touch of realism to the base. To make Deadpool's suit pop out and add more definition, I started by painting thin black lines around the suit's features. This step added contrast and helped emphasize the different sections of his costume, giving it a more dynamic, detailed appearance. Next, I turned my attention to Deadpool's eyes. Using white paint, I proceeded to paint his eyes. For the belt, I used brown acrylic paint to give it a leather-like appearance. Once the brown paint dried, I added a touch of copper and silver metallic paint to the belt buckle. Finally, it was time to add a little shine to Deadpool's weapons and accessories. Using a small brush, I dipped it lightly into some silver metallic paint and gently applied it to his katanas, guns, knife and other areas where a bit of metallic shine felt right. I added some shadows with black eyeshadow. Using an applicator, I gently applied it to various parts of his suit. I wanted to protect the paint with a clear lacquer, so I grabbed a hobby and craft sealer. I forgot it was glossy, and as I sprayed I thought, oh no, this is too much. But then something unexpected happened. I loved the wet look it gave Deadpool. The glossy finish added a shiny, almost slippery texture that surprisingly suited his personality perfectly. The Arduino code for this project, like Deadpool's body, went through several iterations. What began as a simple idea, playing a fart noise before the air freshener activated, quickly became more chaotic. I thought, why stop at a fart noise? What a waste of the DF player and SD card. So I added some of Deadpool's one-liners from the movies with plans to add more later. After all, you can never have too much Deadpool. Initially, I thought 4 AA batteries would be enough, but they couldn't handle the DF player's current draw. I switched to 2 1865 Zero batteries, which worked better but only lasted about 3 days. To fix the battery drain, I introduced a BS170N channel MOSFET into the circuit. With some extra Arduino coding, I extended the battery life to around 10 days by efficiently controlling the power to the DF player. Once satisfied with the code, I uploaded it to an Arduino Nano clone and prepped the SD card for the DF player. Following the diagram I had created, I connected all the electronic components. At this point, the air freshener no longer had its original circuit board inside. The 2 wires coming out of the air freshener were directly connected to the motor, with the Arduino taking care of controlling everything. Once everything was wired up, it was time to test the system and make sure it was all working as intended. This meant checking the connections, ensuring the motor activated when triggered, and verifying that the DF player played the correct sounds in sequence. After confirming that all the electronics were functioning correctly, I moved on to soldering the components onto a prototype board. With the soldering complete, I tested the system again to make sure everything was still working as expected. And sure enough, everything was running smoothly. With all the electronics wired up and tested, it was time to secure everything. I used hot glue to secure the speaker, LED, and PIR sensor in their respective openings, ensuring they were snug. Next, I positioned the prototype board inside the base, making the Arduino and SD card easily accessible for updates. Once in place, I secured it with hot glue. To keep the wiring neat and avoid disconnections, I glued the wires along the base, leaving enough slack for the air freshener to be easily removed for refills. Around this time, I realized having control over the volume without needing to tweak the code would be a great addition. So I soldered a 1 kilo-ohm potentiometer to the speaker's positive wire, allowing adjustments with a screwdriver. I glued it into the base, accessible but out of the way. Finally, to secure the air freshener while allowing easy removal, I hot glued an elastic band into the base, keeping it snug and stable during use. To keep Deadpool running without draining the batteries completely, I added a battery protection board. I 3D printed 18,650 battery holders, connected wires to the protection board, and soldered everything according to my diagram. This board prevents the batteries from overdraining, ensuring efficient use. The protection board required activation to provide voltage. Instead of using an external power source, I added a small push button between the negative battery and output terminals, allowing me to activate the board easily after replacing the batteries. Once configured, I glued the battery holders inside the base, connected the negative wire to the Arduino for grounding, and routed the positive wire through the toggle switch for easy power control. With the electronics all set and Deadpool almost complete, it was time to add a few final touches. Using a red glitter glue stick, I made a custom top in the shape of a small mushroom for the push button. And of course, no Deadpool project would be complete without a nod to his love for all things quirky, and what better way to do that than with his iconic Hello Kitty backpack. This project took far longer than expected, with 60 hours of footage and countless hours spent on coding, wiring, and adding extras like the backpack and unicorn. Despite the challenges, I'm thrilled that Deadpool is finally complete, proudly displayed on my mantle, and farting every half hour as planned. I learned a lot through this process, from sculpting and painting to coding and wiring. Each challenge pushed me to find creative solutions and grow in both technical and artistic skills. I'm excited about the idea of creating a 3D printable version for others who share this weird sense of humor but lack the time or patience to sculpt from clay. It's a future project I'm eager to explore. For now, I'm just enjoying the satisfaction of bringing this quirky idea to life. If you're crazy enough to recreate this project, all the necessary files, including templates, Arduino code, and instructions, are available on my website, nerdycat.net. And remember, if Deadpool can make farting cool, so can you. Catch you in the next video.
What's a nice place like you doing and a girl like this?